Hello, learners. Welcome to another lecture in this NPTEL course on Victorian literature. In the previous lectures, I gave a general introduction to the historical, social, economic, and cultural context to Victorian England, especially in the decades of the 1840s and the early 1850s. The goal of that introduction was to try and understand the social world from which Elizabeth Barrett Browning's novel Aurora Leigh emerged. Today, we will begin understanding the author's more immediate context and also begin reading from Aurora Leigh itself. I ended my previous lecture, many of you will recall, by reading an excerpt from Matthew Arnold's letter to Arthur Clough. In this letter, Matthew Arnold expresses a great deal of suspicion. This was a counter note to the expressions of optimism and hope which one finds in a lot of novels of the late 1840s and the early 1850s. And I had demonstrated that optimism by reading from David Copperfield, a novel, somewhat typical novel by Charles Dickens, in which the protagonist starts as a very poor, underprivileged, suffering child made to work long hours in a factory and in very inhuman conditions, but ends in a great deal of comfort and ease, both financial security as well as social respect. In that narrative was found to be acceptable by many readers in Victorian England who equated the prosperity of protagonists like David with the economic prosperity of England as a nation in the geopolitical scene of 19th century England. The 1840s were a decade that changed from hunger, inequality in the early years of the decade to a great deal of prosperity in the latter half of the decade. That optimism is reflected in David Copperfield. A poet like Matthew Arnold, however, found something not very optimistic and was in fact quite suspicious. And here is how Matthew Arnold expresses his suspicion. These are damn times. Everything is against one. The height to which knowledge has come, the spread of luxury, our physical enervation, the absence of great natures, the unavoidable contact with millions of small ones, newspapers, cities, light profligate friends, moral desperadoes like Carlyle, and our own selves, and the sickening consciousness of our difficulties. Now, in this utterance, we can see that for Matthew Arnold, the problem is that there's a great deal of contradiction in the times in which they were all alive. The contradiction refers to the spread of knowledge, which produced a great deal of doubt about the moral certainties of previous times. One instance in which the tension between knowledge and doubt existed was that of religion. I mentioned earlier that the works by Charles Darwin would throw into great uncertainty the idea that the human body or the human being was created by a divine power, and instead suggested, with a great deal of scientific evidence, that the human body had in fact evolved from less simpler amphibious beings. This kind of confusion was not being addressed or described or even diagnosed by poets. There were moral desperados like Carlyle, which I described in my first lecture, but they were exactly that. They were desperados. They provided radical, heroic sounding stories, but they didn't diagnose it like a poet. And in fact, there seems to be a vacuum of poetic works that address the complexity, the doubt, and the uncertainty of the Victorian times. This is Matthew Arnold's complaint. And into this complaint, there was also a great deal of discussion about what kind of content should poets write about? What should poets describe in their poems? This question was difficult to answer because there was disagreement about whether poets should improve their content or their form, right? Meaning, should writers write realistic fictional prose like novels, or should they write poetry? Because it was sensed that novels were popular because people wanted to read about their own times. People could relate to characters from their own times. And novels allowed writers and readers to follow the development of characters, fictional individuals, over time. So, one way that poets were challenged to update their content and to become relevant in this time of great change was by writing new kinds of works. Right? So, Elizabeth Barrett Browning was one of those writers who experienced this kind of doubt. She debated whether to write fiction, prose, or fictional verse. And the key determinant between these two forms was which would be more realistic, which would appear more relatable, which would be taken up and read with enthusiasm and interest by readers. In addition to the difference between form and content, there was also a debate over different kinds of content. A lot of poets described fantastical, mythical, historical worlds, people and settings that were very different from the kinds of people and contexts that Victorian readers saw around themselves. So the choice was between realistic and fantastical settings and characters for one's poems. Elizabeth Barrett Browning faced these debates and faced these dilemmas very immediately because she was reading works by poets like Tennyson and Browning, some of whose settings were quite different, quite removed from Victorian England. Tennyson wrote many Arthurian epics. Browning also wrote several works set in historically different settings. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's concern was to decide which of these would provide a more relatable and realistic setting for her own work. So there was also this question of what and who to write about. Figures from myths or ordinary people like herself and like her readers. Ultimately, Elizabeth Barrett Browning decided to base her magnum opus, that is, her most ambitious work of poetry, a book length verse, that is, a poem that was as long as a book, in 9 books to be precise, 1 volume, but 9 books of poetry, which would describe the growth and development of a poet. This was to be titled Aurora Leigh, and this was published in the year 1854. I want to read briefly from a letter that Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote to Robert Browning, who would be her future husband, right? And this is one of the early letters that she wrote to Browning. Elizabeth Barrett Browning writes, "I have lived only inwardly. Before this seclusion of my illness, I was secluded still, and there are few of the youngest women in the world who have not seen more, heard more, known more of society than I, who am scarcely to be called young now. I grew up in the country, had no social opportunities, had my heart in books and poetry, and my experience in reveries. Do you also know what a disadvantage this ignorance is to my art? Why, if I live on and yet do not escape from this seclusion, do you not perceive that I labor under signal disadvantages? That I am, in a manner, as a blind poet? Certainly there is a compensation to a degree. I have had much of the inner life, and from the habit of self-consciousness, of self-analysis, I make great guesses at human nature in the main. But how willingly I would, as a poet, exchange some of this lumbering, ponderous, helpless knowledge of books for some experience of life and man." So you see from this quote how the poet is extremely conscious of her limitations, and these come from her biological as well as her cultural and social situation. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was born a woman, and that has been the cause for a great deal of the seclusion that she faces. What is this kind of seclusion? She spends a lot of time by herself, does not go out, does not spend a lot of time in public, interacting with people who do different things for living, who earn their living by engaging in different forms of labor or trade. There is a great deal of the public world which is inaccessible and unknown to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. This quote also refers to the connection between poetry and inwardness. Barrett Browning refers to how, because she's been self conscious as a person, she has analyzed herself a lot. She has written and thought about her own self, her own feelings, her own experiences. That makes her a very perceptive poet, but it also makes her, in some ways, ill equipped to write about the times. Right? If she wants to write a poetic work which will be taken seriously as a representation of the Victorian era, then in some ways she is ill equipped. Further, there's also the connection between inwardness and femininity. In many parts of the world in the 19th century, ideal womanhood was equated with being confined to the inner spaces of the home. Ideal womanhood was defined as an inwardness, right? And these are some obvious problems. These are things that make it difficult for a poet's work to be taken seriously as a representation of the times in which she lives. However, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's accomplishment will be to turn these factors, these causes or these limitations, these causes of her being ill equipped, into the foundation of her claim to representativeness. A woman poet's growth became the most representative story of the Victorian era because it was through the struggle, through the effort to grow and learn her craft, be published, and ultimately describe the world, ultimately to create a claim that would be respected as truthful, using the talent and craft of poetry, that Elizabeth Barrett Browning herself, as well as her protagonist and narrator, Aurora Leigh, became representative Victorian individuals. Right? We will understand that as we read quotations from the work in the next two lectures. While preparing to and while composing the work Aurora Leigh, Elizabeth Barrett Browning struggled a lot to find ideal subjects as well as literary models on which to base her book and from which to learn how to write. Why was this? This was because she wanted to write about the growth of the female mind, the growth of a female poet. There just did not exist any literary models that she could use as a template from which to depart or using which to build a foundation from. The best or the closest possible model or template that she could find was William Wordsworth's autobiographical poem, The Prelude. This was published in the year 1850, and this describes the growth of a male poet much like William Wordsworth himself. Elizabeth Barrett Browning once wrote, and I quote, "I look everywhere for grandmothers and see none." What does this mean? Why is this poet looking for grandmothers? She's not looking for physical or actual women who can be old enough to serve as her grandmothers. In fact, she is looking for literary antecedents. She is looking for women who might have written something that might help her, that might guide her, that might serve as an outline or a roadmap that can guide her own poetic ambition and career. So this is an instance of the lack of women's writing because women were not encouraged to write or describe the growth of their poetic, spiritual, emotional, and intellectual trajectories. There simply did not exist texts or writing that Elizabeth Barrett Browning could use at the time when she was preparing to write Aurora Leigh. Right? So the lack of women's careers, The lack of self-consciousness about women writers and how they grew and developed serious and seriously intended artists. This is the reason why Barrett Browning looks for grandmothers but fails to find any, and decides to take inspiration from the work which describes the growth of a male poet, that is, Wordsworth's The Prelude. There are many similarities between William Wordsworth's The Prelude and Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh. Both of these works describe the growth, the development, and the trajectory of poets. Both of these works end when the poet narrators reach their fourth decade, respectively. In both of these works, the narrators lose their parents very early in their lives. They describe the development of the intellect, that is, how these poets learn to think, learn to write. They describe how the development of the poet's skill at writing and expression helps them substitute the natural bond that they had with their parents and which was lost with social bonds that they develop with the world around them. These works also describe how the poets steadily, slowly, and through great labor develop their vocation and become better at what they do, that is, their work of writing poems. The works also describe the importance of social reform. That is, in addition to the growth of individual poets, there is also a need for society to evolve and to be reformed in more ethical, more just, more equitable ways. So, for instance, in William Wordsworth, there is a great deal of reference to the intellectual ferment, the intellectual change that culminated in the French Revolution. William Wordsworth, as a young man, had traveled to France to witness the French Revolution and describes his travel going from rural conservative England to revolutionary France, witnessing the power of intellectual thought, witnessing the power of social change fueled by the spread of new ideas, and then coming back and reflecting on how these changes could not be found in England and the necessity of these changes in England. Finally, both of these works, that is, Wordsworth's The Prelude and Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh, reinstill and consolidate the readers as well as the protagonists and narrators' faith in poetry. Poetry is presented as a force for the good. It enables the narrators to find satisfaction, sustainability in their emotional and personal lives. It also provides the narrators with a great deal of professional and financial success as they become successful, published poets. And so generally, both of these works affirm the potential for poetry to serve as a force for good in the social world in which the poets exist, as well as the poets' own lives and careers. In addition to these similarities, there are a great deal of differences between the Prelude and Aurora Leigh. The first and most obvious, and from which other differences emerge, and which constitutes the different universes that these works create, is that of gender. The Prelude describes the growth of a male poet. Aurora Leigh describes a similar trajectory for a female poet. Because of this difference, there is, or maybe not, but we will see how these two are connected when we read quotations from Aurora Leigh. Because of the difference of gender, the two works also describe the relationships between the narrators and other human beings in different ways. Aurora Leigh is very open and honest and embraces, with a great deal of enthusiasm, the poet's dependence on human love. Aurora Leigh also describes the importance of feelings. On the other hand, in Wordsworth's Prelude, solitude is viewed very differently. Solitude is guarded as something very precious, something very privileged, something that the poet is actually very privileged to be able to enjoy. So you can see how value of human relationships is presented and articulated very differently. In Wordsworth's account of the growth of a male poet, human relationships are lost. The poet becomes more alone, and the solitude that results from this end or rejection or lack of human relationships at some points is valued, is placed at a very high pedestal, because it is from this solitude that the poet sustains his career, his writing, his vocation, his ability to, in fact, continue being a poet. On the other hand, in Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh, solitude is not such a privilege, solitude is not such a wonderful, powerful thing to be placed on a pedestal. In fact, for Browning's Aurora Leigh, it is not escape from human relationships, but rather the entanglement in human relationships that produces the sustaining power of poetry for the writer. Wordsworth's narrator mentions that he was taught to feel perhaps too much. Too much feeling is a bad thing for the male poet, narrator, protagonist of Wordsworth's The Prelude. There is no such suspicion of feeling too much or too little in Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh. For the narrator of Wordsworth's Prelude, solitude has a self-sufficing power. Instead, for Browning's Aurora Leigh, solitude is not so much self-sufficing as solitude is something that needs to be survived, experienced, and essential sustenance will always be gained from human connections and love. The loving presence of other human beings is more important than the self-sufficing power of solitude. So these are the two main differences. And there were also other possible role models that Elizabeth Barrett Browning looked for in the work of women writers. So remember her quotation, her line about how she was looking for grandmothers but could not find any. That seems to be a strange thing to say, given that writers like Jane Austen and several other women novelists had existed, had written and read and were greatly celebrated by the time Elizabeth Barrett Browning begins her career. So why did Barrett Browning not consider Jane Austen to be a grandmother? And like Jane Austen, there were several others. The reason for that is the style and manner in which Jane Austen describes the situation or the condition of women in 19th century England. For Jane Austen, it was a very unpoetic, a very realistic and very mundane and pragmatic world that Barrett Browning saw, and this world did not hold much attraction for Browning. Browning wanted to describe a world which would have some sort of poetic ideal, powerful emotions, but also removed from the pragmatic, mundane, and practical concerns of securing the hand of a wealthy or financially secure man in marriage. Compared to Jane Austen, the work of Madame de Staël, whose famous work was Corinne, published in the year 1807, formed a better, more attractive, more usable role model and template for Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So these were some thoughts about the kind of preparation, the kind of dilemmas that Elizabeth Barrett Browning faced while she wrote Aurora Leigh. We will begin the next lecture by focusing on the words of Barrett Browning herself, and we will read the opening lines from Aurora Leigh and try and understand what is the power and complexity of this work of Victorian poetry. Thank you.